Oak. The winter of 1887 did not arrive in the Peace River country of the Northwest Territories. It descended. It came without warning and without mercy, driving down from the Arctic in a single night that turned the mud along the river trail to iron and froze the last of the garden turnips solid in the ground. Oak. By the time Clara Ashford woke to find frost lacing the inside of the cabin's single window, the temperature had already dropped to a place where breath turned to crystal before it reached the air. Oak. She was 23 years old, and she had 4 days of oats left, a half-wheel of hard cheese, and 2 younger brothers who still believed she had everything under control. Oak. She did not have everything under control. Oak. Thomas was 11, gap-toothed and serious in the way that boys become serious when they are forced to carry grief too young. Eli was 8, still soft around the edges, still capable of the particular cruelty of hope. Their father, Robert Ashford, had been a trapper and a good one, a man who knew the bush the way other men knew their own kitchen floors. He had gone out in October on what should have been a 3-day line check and had not come back. Oak. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police had found his canoe overturned on the river bend 12 miles north. They had not found him. Oak. Clara had spent the first 2 weeks of November believing he was still out there. By the 3rd week, she had quietly begun to grieve. By December, she had made herself stop grieving entirely, because grief was a luxury and wood needed to be split. Oak. The debt was the other thing. Robert had borrowed against the season's fur harvest from a man named Edmund Holt, who operated a trading post and a money-lending operation out of the nearest settlement, a half-day's ride south called Millhaven. Holt was the kind of man who wore a clean shirt every day of the week in a country where clean shirts were a statement of power. He had already sent a man to the cabin twice with papers Clara had refused to sign. Oak. The 3rd time, Holt had come himself, standing in her doorway with a sympathetic expression that did not reach his eyes, telling her he could take the trapping rights to Robert's territory and settle the debt peaceable, or he could take them through the magistrate and she could lose the land too. Oak. She had told him she would have the money by spring. Oak. She did not know how she would have the money by spring. Oak. On the morning of December 9th, Clara pulled on her father's heavy moosehide coat, wrapped her wool scarf twice around her face, and went out to check the snares she had set along the creek line. The sky was the color of old pewter. The spruce trees stood perfectly still. Cold like that had a weight to it, a pressure against the ears and the chest, and Clara moved quickly, not from fear but from the practical understanding that still bodies in extreme cold were bodies that stopped working. Oak. She found 2 rabbits in the snares, which was something. She reset the wire, tucked the rabbits into her canvas pack, and had turned back toward the cabin when she saw the dark shape half buried against the base of a deadfall spruce not 30 feet from the creek bank. Oak. Her first thought was bear. A bear denned badly, wedged against the wrong tree, exposed to the wind. She raised the .303 rifle she carried over her shoulder and took 3 careful steps forward before she understood that what she was looking at was not a bear. Oak. It was a man. Oak. He was enormous, broad across the shoulders, dressed in layers of canvas and wool and a beaver fur vest that had probably saved his life through the night. He was face up, which was the only reason Clara could see the slow, almost imperceptible movement of his chest. His right leg was bent at an angle that legs did not naturally bend at. Oak. A broken branch the thickness of her wrist lay across him, snapped from the deadfall above, and the snow beneath his right thigh was stained in a dark spreading circle that the cold had slowed but not stopped. Oak. He was bleeding. He had been bleeding for hours. Oak. Clara stood there for a full 10 seconds. This was, she understood, a decision point of the kind that did not announce itself as one. The man was a stranger. The bush north of the Peace River in December was not a place where strangers arrived accidentally, unless something had gone very badly wrong for them. He could be a criminal, he could be a drunk, he could be a man with enemies who would follow his tracks directly to her door. Oak. He let out a sound then, not quite a groan. Something quieter and more defeated than a groan. The sound of a man who had stopped expecting rescue. Oak. Clara unslung her rifle, leaned it against the nearest spruce, and went to him. Oak. Getting him back to the cabin took everything she had. She could not carry him. She was 5'4", and he was built like the men who felled timber for a living. What she could do was cut 2 lengths of poplar sapling, lash them together with the leather cord from her snare bag and drag him on the makeshift sled the way her father had taught her to drag a downed moose. It took 40 minutes to cover a distance that should have taken 8. By the time she kicked open the cabin door, her lungs were burning, and her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. Thomas, she called, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. I need you now. Don't ask questions. Thomas came around the curtain partition from the back of the cabin, took one look at the massive, blood-soaked stranger on the doorstep, and went pale as birch bark. But he did not ask questions. He grabbed the man's ankles without being told. Eli appeared from the corner where he'd been feeding the stove and immediately pressed himself against the far wall. Clara, who is that? I don't know yet, she said. Get the kettle on. The man's name, she would learn, was Jedediah Cross. She learned this from the worn leather document wallet she found buttoned into the inner pocket of his canvas coat while she was cutting the coat away to get at his leg. She did not open the wallet then. She set it on the shelf above the stove and focused on the leg, which was broken cleanly mid-thigh, the bone intact but the surrounding tissue badly torn by what she suspected had been a deadfall collapse. He had almost certainly dragged himself to the base of that spruce oak, which meant he had been conscious at some point in the night and had not called out, which meant either no one was within hearing distance or he had chosen not to call. She set the leg the way her father had set a neighbor's broken forearm when she was 16, with 2 flat boards from the kindling pile, strips torn from a flour sack, and the grim mechanical focus of someone who does not allow themselves to feel the gravity of what they are doing until it is done. The stranger remained unconscious through all of it, which was a mercy for both of them. The fever came that evening. Clara sent the boys to bed behind the curtain partition and sat beside Jedediah Cross on the floor of the cabin, pressing cold water to his forehead and listening to him talk. Delirious men told the truth in ways that conscious men didn't. She had learned this from her father, who had sat vigil beside a sick trapper once, and heard the man confess to a theft he had committed 11 years prior. The survey, Jedediah muttered, his head turning side to side. Northern boundary, he moved the stakes. I've got the numbers, they can't. He broke off, his jaw clenching. Don't let Holt file. Don't let him file the claim. Clara went very still. Holt. Edmund Holt, who had lent her father money at interest that compounded faster than a man could trap fur. Edmund Holt, who wanted the Ashford trapping territory badly enough to visit twice before the ground had fully frozen. She had assumed it was standard greed. The Ashford trap lines along the Peace River were some of the best established in the district. But a survey, boundary stakes, a claim. She looked at the document wallet on the shelf. She took it down and opened it. Jedediah Cross was a Dominion land surveyor, contracted through the Department of the Interior in Ottawa. His papers were authorized under the seal of the territorial government, and in his careful, precise hand, across 6 pages of graph-lined paper, he had documented something that explained quite clearly why Edmund Holt wanted Robert Ashford's trap-line territory. The creek that ran through the Ashford land was not a minor drainage. It was the primary tributary feeding the larger river basin to the north, and according to Jedediah's survey notes, the land along its upper bank held one of the richest, most accessible beaver colonies in the entire Peace River watershed. More than that, the notes referenced a planned route for a Hudson's Bay Company resupply road, which would pass directly through the territory, making it not simply valuable as a trap line but as a right-of-way. Land along a company road was worth tenfold what wilderness land was worth. Holt knew. Somehow Holt already knew, and he had been moving survey stakes along the northern boundary. Jedediah had documented it, had physically remeasured the discrepancy and recorded it in ink, to incorporate the most valuable portion of the Ashford land into a parcel he intended to claim as his own. A hand closed around Clara's wrist. She did not scream. She had been raised in the bush, and her nerves were not the theatrical kind. But she went perfectly rigid, because Jedediah Cross had come back to consciousness without any warning, and his grip was, even in his damaged state, startlingly strong. His eyes were open, dark gray, fever-clouded, but focused on her with an intensity that suggested the delirium had passed, at least partially. Those are government documents, he said. His voice was low and rough as creek gravel. I'm aware, Clara said. She did not try to pull her wrist away. I also pulled you out of the snow this morning, so I think we've established a degree of trust. Oak. He stared at her for a moment. Then slowly the grip on her wrist loosened. Oak. How bad is the leg? He asked. Oak. Broken, set and bound. You won't lose it if you don't do anything stupid. Oak. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Edmund Holt's men did the deadfall. Oak. His men were up there? Oak. 2 of them. Following me since Millhaven. They couldn't get the wallet away from me, so He stopped, jaw tightening. It was meant to look like an accident. Oak. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at this enormous broken stranger lying on her cabin floor, and she thought about her father's canoe found overturned on the river bend with no body. She thought about how Robert Ashford had refused twice to sell his trapline to Holt. She thought about how the bush was unforgiving and accidents happened. Oak. She wondered if her father's accident had happened. Oak. My name is Clara Ashford, she said. This was my father's land. He went missing 6 weeks ago. Oak. Jedediah Cross looked at her steadily. The firelight moved across the deep lines of his face. He was older than her, 35 perhaps, or 40. The kind of man whose age was difficult to read because the elements had written themselves across him independent of years. Oak. Robert Ashford, he said slowly. It was not a question. Oak. You knew him? Oak. I knew of him. His trapline boundaries are in my survey. He's the reason the northern claim is disputed, because his registered territory overlaps with what Holt tried to incorporate. Jedediah was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your father, Miss Ashford. Oak. Clara did not say anything. She had learned that grief acknowledged out loud had a tendency to undo her entirely, and she could not afford to be undone. She stood up and went to the stove. Oak. You'll stay until you can walk, she said, her back to him. The boys and I need the firewood split, and you'll owe us that much when you're able. Until then, you'll eat what we eat, and you'll sleep by the stove. Oak. There was a pause. Oak. That's a fair arrangement, said Jedediah Cross. Oak. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Clara had not expected. She had anticipated the stranger would be a burden, and in the purely physical sense he was. He could not stand for the first 5 days, and feeding and managing a man of his size on limited supplies required constant arithmetic. But Jedediah Cross did not behave like a burden. Oak. He was quiet in the way that competent men were quiet, and within 48 hours he had made himself useful from the floor, sharpening tools that Clara brought to him, resplicing a worn section of snare wire with fingers that worked with precise, practiced ease, and talking to Thomas. Oak. This was the part Clara had not anticipated. Oak. Thomas had been mostly silent since their father's disappearance. He had taken on chores without complaint, had stopped asking questions about when things might change, and had acquired a quality of stillness that sat uneasily on an 11-year-old boy. On the second evening, Jedediah had asked Thomas what he knew about reading the land for sign, for tracks, for movement, for the small indicators that animals and men left behind them. Oak. Thomas had sat down slowly, almost despite himself, and they had talked for 2 hours. Oak. By the 4th day, Thomas was asking questions. Oak. By the 6th day, Jedediah was teaching him to read a survey compass. Oak. Eli, for his part, had decided that Jedediah Cross was the most interesting thing that had ever been in the cabin, and interrogated him with the thoroughness that 8-year-olds reserved for topics of genuine fascination. He wanted to know how far Jedediah had traveled. He wanted to know about wolves. He wanted to know why surveyors used chains to measure land when chains were for boats. Oak. Jedediah answered every question with the same even, unhurried attention, and Clara, pretending to mend a harness by the window, found herself listening. Oak. At night, after the boys were behind the curtain, she and Jedediah talked. Not about the survey, about other things. He told her about the high country north of the territories, the strange flat light of the Arctic in summer, the way the tundra smelled after a week of rain. She told him about growing up along the Peace River, about learning to run a trapline at 12, about the way the ice went out in spring with a cracking sound like cannon fire that you felt in your teeth. Oak. She did not tell him that she was frightened, but she thought he understood it anyway. Oak. On the 9th day, the cold lifted slightly. The temperature was still brutal, but the killing pressure of the deep freeze had eased enough that horses could move on the trail. Clara knew what that meant. She had been watching the southern trail for 2 days, the way Jedediah had taught her to watch without appearing to watch. Oak. He was on the porch by then, leaning on a rough crutch Thomas had cut and shaped from a birch fork, testing the leg with careful, deliberate weight. He had been watching the same trail. Oak. They'll come today or tomorrow, he said, without turning around, when Clara stepped out beside him. Oak. I know. Oak. How much ammunition do you have for the .303? Oak. Enough. Oak. He looked at her then. Clara, they're not going to just ask nicely. Oak. I know that too. She crossed her arms against the cold. The morning light was coming low and pale across the spruce tops. My father built this cabin. He cleared this land with a Swede saw and a bad back. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not leaving. Oak. Jedediah was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, I can't run, but I can shoot sitting down. Oak. You're not shooting anyone from a crutch. Oak. I can shoot from a chair. Oak. She looked at him. He looked back at her. It would have been easier if he had suggested something sensible like going to Millhaven for the mounted police. She had thought of this herself and dismissed it for the same reason he probably had. The constable in Millhaven owed his trading credit to Holt, and they both knew it. Oak. I'll get you the chair, she said. Oak. They came in the early afternoon, 4 riders, which was 2 more than Clara had expected. Holt was not among them. He would not come himself. He was too careful for that. The man in front was the one who had brought the papers in November, a rangy, thin-faced man named Porter whom half of Millhaven would recognize. Behind him rode 2 men she had never seen, the kind who did not need to be recognized. Oak. The fourth was younger, barely older than Thomas, sitting his horse with the tight-shouldered look of someone who was nervous and trying very hard not to show it. Oak. Clara stood in the yard. Oak. She had put Jedediah in the chair just inside the doorway, where he was visible from the yard but shielded from the direct line of the trail. She had the .303 in her hands, not raised, not pointed, just held, the way her father had always held it when he was making a point. Oak. Miss Ashford, Porter called out, drawing his horse up at the edge of the yard. We're not here for trouble. Mr. Holt wants those documents returned, and he's authorized me to offer you full settlement of your father's debt and safe passage south. Oak. Safe passage, Clara repeated. The words tasted the way Edmund Holt's clean shirts looked. Oak. The debt's cleared. You take the boys and go. Nobody gets hurt. Oak. Those documents belong to the Dominion government, Clara said. The surveyor who carried them is inside this cabin, recovering from injuries that your men put him in. I imagine the Department of the Interior is going to have a considerable number of questions about that. Oak. Porter's affable expression shifted. It did not become threatening exactly. It simply stopped being affable. He looked past her toward the cabin doorway. He saw Jedediah Cross, sitting in the chair with a rifle across his knees. And for one flat, honest second, Porter looked like a man revising his understanding of the situation. Oak. This doesn't have to be difficult, he said. Oak. No, Clara agreed, it doesn't. Oak. What happened next happened fast, in the way that violence always surprised Clara even when she had prepared for it. By compressing time until each moment had a strange, overexposed clarity. Porter's hand went to his coat. Clara raised the .303. The shot that came first was not hers, and was not Porter's. It came from Jedediah in the doorway, deliberate and precise, kicking up snow 6 inches in front of Porter's horse's front hooves. Oak. The horse shied violently, nearly unseating Porter. The 2 strangers behind him had their hands on their guns but had not drawn, and in that instant of hesitation Jedediah racked the lever and put the second shot even closer. Oak. Next one doesn't go in the snow, he said. He said it conversationally, the way he said most things. Oak. The young rider at the back had gone completely still. His face, under the brim of his hat, was the face of a boy who had ridden out thinking this would be something simpler than it was. Oak. Porter got his horse under control. He was breathing hard and the affability was entirely gone now. He looked at Clara with an expression that had some hatred in it and some calculation, and unexpectedly, a thin edge of something like embarrassment. Oak. Holt won't let this go, he said. Oak. Holt, said Clara, is going to have his hands full explaining to the territorial government why his boundary stakes don't match the Dominion survey records. Oak. She had not planned to say it quite that directly. But she found that she meant it entirely, and that the steadiness in her own voice surprised her. Oak. Porter looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse, and the 4 riders went back down the southern trail, and the sound of their hooves faded into the cold silence of the spruce. Oak. Clara lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking, though she had not noticed while she was holding it. Oak. Thomas appeared in the cabin doorway, slightly behind Jedediah, his face pale but his chin up. Eli was pressed to the window glass, eyes enormous. She looked at them both, and then at Jedediah, who was watching her, with the particular expression of a man who had just seen something he had not fully expected. "Oak. Well," he said. "Oak. Well," she agreed and went inside to put the kettle on. "Oak." The territorial constable arrived from Peace River Settlement 4 days later, accompanied by a federal agent from Edmonton who had apparently been looking for Jedediah Cross for 2 weeks. The document wallet was examined, the survey records were verified, and the discrepancy in Holt's boundary stakes was confirmed within the week by a second government surveyor sent up expressly for that purpose. Oak. Edmund Holt was arrested on a Tuesday, quietly, in the back office of his trading post, while a customer was still waiting at the front counter. Oak. He faced charges of fraud, falsification of territorial land records, and this was the part that arrived slowly and then all at once, the way the worst things always did. Possible complicity in the death of Robert Ashford, whose overturned canoe had been found 6 miles downstream of a river crossing that Holt's men were known to have been working near in October. Oak. The investigation into Robert's death would take months. Clara understood this. She had allowed herself in the privacy of the woodshed one afternoon, while the boys were inside, one long, wrecked hour of grief and fury and the particular devastation of having suspected and now knowing. Then she had come back in and started dinner. Oak. The land, the government's representative assured her, was undisputably the Ashford family's. The registered trapline boundaries, restored to their correct positions per Jedediah's survey, encompassed the full creek territory that Holt had tried to claim. Oak. More than that, the Hudson's Bay Company representative, who arrived in January with the patience of a man accustomed to long journeys to small cabins, offered Clara a right-of-way lease for the road route that would pass through the northern section of the property. Not a sale, a lease. A lease that would pay more per year than her father had trapped in 3 good seasons combined. Oak. She would not lose the land, she would not need to. Oak. In February, the thaw was still months away, but there was a different quality to the cold. Less killing, more patient. The kind of cold that carried the idea of spring somewhere deep inside it without yet being willing to admit it. Oak. Jedediah Cross was walking without the crutch, slowly, and with a particular kind of deliberateness that suggested the leg would carry him, but not without reminding him of the price. He had his gear packed, his surveying equipment cleaned and checked and stowed. His document wallet returned to him with a receipt from the federal agent. His beaver fur vest, mended by Clara with thread that didn't quite match and which he examined once without comment. Oak. He was on the porch when she came out in the early morning. The sky to the east was the faint tentative rose of February sunrise, which lasted approximately 11 minutes before the gray reasserted itself. Oak. The passes will be manageable, he said, which was not quite a greeting, and was also not quite what he had come out to say. Oak. They will, Clara agreed. Oak. I've got the Northern District to finish by April, 3 more townships. Oak. That's a long way. Oak. It is. Oak. The sunrise continued its brief, determined effort against the gray. A whiskey jack landed on the porch railing, looked at both of them with its small black eyes, and flew away. Oak. Jedediah, Clara said. Oak. Clara, he said at almost exactly the same moment. Oak. They were quiet for a moment in the particular way of 2 people who have said each other's names in the same breath, and are now accounting for what that means. Oak. The boys, Clara said finally, are going to need someone who knows the territory, when the ground opens, for the trap line. She was looking at the spruce line, not at him. Thomas is nearly old enough to run a short line, but he doesn't know the northern sections. Oak. No, Jedediah agreed, he doesn't. Oak. I don't imagine a Dominion surveyor is required to be anywhere specific once the Northern District is finished. Oak. The department, Jedediah said carefully, has some flexibility in terms of extended assignment locations. Oak. Clara finally looked at him. He was looking at her already, which she had suspected without quite being ready to see confirmed. He was not a man whose face gave much away, but there was something in it now that was not armored, and it had been there long enough that she understood it had not arrived recently. Oak. The government lease needs a registered land agent to manage the paperwork, she said. I am 23 years old and I have never dealt with the Department of the Interior. Oak. That, said Jedediah Cross. after a pause that was long enough to be honest and short enough to be decided, is a problem I could help with. Oak. The winter broke in April, as it always did, indifferently, and then all at once the river ice fracturing with the great cannonball cracks that Clara felt in her back teeth, the meltwater rushing dark and cold over the banks and then retreating, leaving behind the turned, dark smell of the earth that her father had called the best smell in the world. Oak. Thomas ran his first trapline section in May, with Jedediah walking the trail behind him, pointing out sign in the mud that Thomas then identified and named correctly half the time and incorrectly the other half, and both of them apparently finding this arrangement satisfactory. Oak. Eli informed anyone who would listen that he was going to be a Dominion surveyor when he grew old enough, and had already asked Jedediah if he could borrow the compass, which Jedediah had allowed under the condition that it came back with all its degrees intact. Oak. Clara stood on the porch one morning in June and watched the three of them come up the trail from the creek, in the early light, Thomas and Jedediah talking about something she couldn't hear, Eli running ahead. The land around them was the particular green of early northern summer, everything growing at once in the short fierce season, the spruce dark and the birch luminous and the creek loud with snowmelt. It looked like her father's land. It looked like hers. Oak. She thought about the winter. About the decision made in 10 seconds at the base of a deadfall spruce, the kind of decision that didn't announce itself as one. About how the hardest thing she had done in her life had looked from the outside like ordinary practicality. Put the kettle on, split the wood, set the legs straight, hold the rifle steady, and only she knew what they had cost. Oak. She thought her father would have approved of Jedediah Cross. The compass, certainly, the steadiness, the way he talked to boys like they were worth talking to. Oak. She thought, too, that he would have wanted her to be something more than steadiness. That he had always said the peace country was big enough for whatever a person decided to become. Oak. She stepped off the porch and walked down to meet them. The morning light long and gold across the flats of the Peace River country, the world opened out on all sides of her, enormous and cold and finally, improbably, hers. Oak. I keep coming back to the moment Clara saw that dark shape in the snow and stood there for 10 full seconds deciding. Not running toward him dramatically, not running away, just standing in the cold doing the quiet, unglamorous work of choosing who she wanted to be. Oak. That's the part that stays with me. Oak. Because what Clara did next, cutting poplar saplings, lashing a sled together, dragging a man twice her weight across frozen ground until her lungs gave out. That wasn't heroism, the way stories usually dress it up. It was just decency, carried out with the same matter-of-fact stubbornness she used to split wood and set snares, and keep two younger brothers from understanding how frightened she actually was. She didn't help Jedediah because she knew it would pay off. Oak. She helped him because she couldn't hear that sound he made, that quiet, defeated sound of a man who had stopped expecting anyone to come and walk away from it. Oak. That's what I think of when I think about what it actually means to have good values. Not grand gestures. Not the easy kindness that costs nothing. The kind that happens when you're already exhausted, already stretched thin, already carrying more than your share. And you stop anyway. Oak. And then there's what Clara did with what she found in that document wallet. She could have handed it over. She could have taken Holt's offer. The debt cleared, a wagon south, a cleaner life somewhere easier. Most people in that position with 2 children, depending on them and winter pressing in, on all sides, would have called that a reasonable decision. Oak. Clara looked at those survey maps and understood immediately what they meant and what they would cost to act on, and she acted on them anyway. That's a different kind of quality entirely. The willingness to think clearly when clarity is inconvenient, to follow an argument to its conclusion, even when the conclusion is frightening. Oak. Jedediah said it plainly to her at the end. Don't ruin your soul for garbage. What he understood, and what Clara already knew in her bones, is that the way we respond to injustice says more about us than the injustice itself does. She raised that rifle. She had every reason. And she lowered it, not from weakness, not from forgiveness she hadn't earned yet, but because she understood that some costs, once paid, can't be refunded. Oak. What I find myself thinking about most, though, is the 10 seconds in the snow. The decision that didn't announce itself as one. The entire rest of it, Jedediah's survival, the survey records, Holt's arrest, the lease, the spring, all of it traces back to that one moment of ordinary, unglamorous moral courage. One act, the right one, at the right time. Oak. The Peace River country is unforgiving. It always has been. But Clara Ashford understood something her father must have taught her. That the land doesn't care about your intentions. It only responds to what you actually do. Oak. What you do, it turns out, is everything.